Africa, and specifically Sub-Saharan Africa, will be the next set of emerging markets after China and Russia and Brazil start to slow. And if you look at the economies there, they're growing dynamically, and yet there are significant challenges. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is talk about the opportunity that we see, but also the challenges that exist there and how a company like Novartis can help be part of the solution. Now, before I do that, though, I want to tell you a little bit about me, just to introduce myself. This was me in 1982, when I had hair. So, you know, I always talk about and think about my experience when I was at Stanford. Stanford is a unique place. It's a place that will stay with you for the rest of your life, and it shapes what you become. And in terms of what I did after I left Stanford, I started my career in consumer packaged goods, actually starting at the Clorox company just up the road in Oakland in a marketing position, and moved my way up and eventually ran a very large division at a pretty young age of the H.J. Heinz company. When I was in Europe, running Europe for Heinz, I was asked by a large pharmaceutical company to sit on their board. And I didn't know much about healthcare, but I fell in love with it. And I wanted to find a way to get into healthcare. So I bridged my way from consumer packaged goods into healthcare through the position that you see, Novartis Consumer Health. I joined as head of the over-the-counter drug business. So it was a way to use my marketing skills for over-the-counter drugs and get into healthcare. Eventually ran the pharmaceutical division and then was named CEO about 4.5 years ago. So I'm in my 5th year as CEO. Now, I want to start by talking about why I believe investing in Africa is so important. And the video that I want to show you that just takes 2 minutes lays out some of the issues from a health challenge standpoint, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, and also talks a little bit about how a company like Novartis can be part of the solution. Issues that are facing Sub-Saharan Africa and why there's also, though, a big opportunity. The first is you've got a fast and growing population. I'll show you some facts in a minute. You also have a growing economy. These are economies that are growing among the fastest in the world, yet there's still significant unmet medical need. So if you start with the population and you look, Africa has about 1.1 billion people, and it's growing at about 2.2%. So it's growing faster than Asia, which was a surprise for many people, and even faster, well, definitely faster than Europe, was essentially flat. Also, the population is urbanizing very rapidly. So there are already 50 cities in Africa that have populations over 1 million people. And by 2030, we estimate that 50% of the population is going to live in the cities. So what does that mean? It means that this population, as it grows, is going to create additional challenges in Sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at 2010 and 2050, over the next 40 years, there's going to be a rapid increase in the number of 15 to 25-year-olds, which will put pressure on the education system. It'll also put significant pressure on the healthcare system and jobs. But the good news is that there is huge upside in terms of financial growth in these countries. Nigeria, 170 million people with an economy that's growing 6 to 7% per year. There's going to be rapid growth, and there's going to be the emergence of a middle class. That we're already seeing it. Yet at the same time, you've got this divergence of significant poverty levels in Africa. So you've got the promise of great economic prosperity coming over the next 20 years, but you also have income disparities that are very, very significant. So what happens is we know that when developing markets around the world start to build middle classes, demand for health care increases pretty significantly. Because as people move into the middle class, expectations around health care increase. As nations become wealthier, they tend to spend more on health care. And we project that in the, let's say, even just the pharmaceutical industry, we expect double-digit growth for the next 10 to 15 years in Africa. But a lot of it is going to be out of pocket because the governments and the reimbursement systems in Africa are nowhere near where they are in Europe or in the U.S. So that's going to create also additional pressure on the healthcare system, this out-of-pocket dynamic that's going on. Another issue that we have to overcome in Sub-Saharan Africa is the inefficiency of the supply chain. So when a company like Novartis sells a product into the supply chain into a country, and let's say that price is an index of 100, you can see that because of the complex supply chain of getting that product to the patients who need it through wholesalers, retailers, and even health shops, which are small, sometimes even just kiosks that exist in rural parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, you can pay 3 times the price that we have sold it into the system. So if you're in Nigeria, you can see prices that are actually higher than in most parts of Europe because of this inefficient supply chain. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how we're addressing that. Now, when you think of Africa and the health care needs, right now, everyone thinks of communicable diseases. So Africa has only 15% of the world's population, but they have a very large percentage of the world's communicable diseases. So over 90% of all malaria cases are in Africa. HIV/AIDS, 3/4. But what's happening now is that as the emerging middle class starts to become wealthier and wealthier, you have a situation where non-communicable diseases are starting to increase at pretty rapid rates. So we think that over the next 20 years, we're going to significantly have to address those non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, cancer, and cardiovascular disease. Now with that kind of as a backdrop, let me tell you about Novartis's approach and what we're doing and what we're taking. And I'd like to introduce the company just for a couple of minutes and then talk to it specifically about what we're doing in Africa. We are a company that is based in Switzerland, so we are a Swiss company. We have a very rich heritage, and it's in our DNA to care for patients. People who come to Novartis, whether you work in as a scientist or as a physician or as a commercial person, they generally come to Novartis because they want to help patients that have significant unmet medical need. And we define our mission as caring and curing. And we measure the number of people that we touch every year with one of our medicines. And last year, this is an audited number, we hit 1.2 billion patients around the world. It's partly because of the diversification that we have for example, our strategy is to win through science-based innovation. So we invest a significant amount of money in discovery and development at a time when many pharmaceutical companies are starting to outsource R&D. We're insourcing R&D, and that's the way that we believe that we will move medicine ahead in the next 20 years. But it starts with the patient needs. So we define what we do as thinking about the needs of people that have healthcare needs. So people need innovative medicines, new cancer drugs that can change the course of a disease, but people also need prevention, vaccines. They need affordable options like generic versions of innovative medicines so that we can increase access to medicines in many countries. And also, they need self-care. Many people around the world are taking health into their own hands, and many over-the-counter drug products will be able to help people around the world care for their own health. So we have structured our divisions. We have 5 divisions. They're quite autonomous, ranging from an innovative pharma division to an eye care division, a generics division, a vaccines division, and then a self-care division. And each of them work together to try to solve healthcare needs around the world. We're a very big company, bigger than what most people think. Our sales last year were $58 billion. We invest $9.9 billion a year in research and development. That makes us the 7th largest company in the world in any industry in terms of the amount that we spend on research and development. We are one of the top 20 companies in the world in terms of market capitalization. We just crossed $200 billion. So this is a company that has significant resources that can help solve healthcare needs around the world. We're most known for changing the practice of medicine in certain diseases. Our most famous drug is called Gleevec, and this is a drug for chronic myeloid leukemia. This was introduced in 2001, and it took what was a death sentence if you were diagnosed with chronic myeloid leukemia, and it turned it into a chronic disease. So we have people that have been on the drug for 13 years. They're leading normal, healthy lives. They take one pill once a day, and we've been able to transform that particular cancer into a chronic disease. We also introduced and discovered the first meningitis B vaccine. So you might have heard that there was an outbreak in Princeton, and there was an outbreak at the University of California, Santa Barbara recently. And even though this vaccine is approved everywhere in the world except the U.S., the government asked us to be able to ship product in, and we vaccinated students at both Princeton and we're about to vaccinate at the University of Santa Barbara, University of California, Santa Barbara. Now, the way that we think about Africa is that I want to be the leading healthcare company in Africa by 2020. Today we're number 3. And we're going to do that not just trying to drive a commercial aspect, but we want to become the leading partner for governments in Africa to significantly improve health care for the African population. And there's 4 ways that we're doing this. We're starting by building local talent. I don't believe that you can run a business in Africa by sending in expats from either Europe or from the U.S. We have to find African talent, build that talent, and build our business through that talent. The second way is that we're improving access to medicines. So if you think about malaria, malaria is a curable disease. We have a drug that cures malaria in 3 days. Yet there are hundreds of thousands of children that die every year from malaria. So improving access is the second big priority. The third big priority is that we must build local capacity, local manufacturing, and local R&D capability. That's because of that horrible supply chain that you just saw that leads to a tripling of prices of medicine because of that supply chain. So we have to go in and we have to build our own supply chain so that we can get those prices to the patients down. And then finally, we have to link corporate responsibility to everything that we're doing. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. Now, starting with the first, in terms of how are we going to, in the world, build talent that can can run what will be a significant business in Africa, local talent. We've started a collaboration with Stellenbosch University in Cape Town, and we've identified great talent in Africa that actually from Nigeria, from Kenya, from Tanzania, where we're training these people in leadership skills, in analytics, in communication skills, in general management skills. And those young professionals will become managers at Novartis in those local markets and help us build the business. We're also bringing them to our headquarters in Basel, Switzerland, and giving them cross-divisional or cross-functional assignments so that they can see how a company like Novartis operates, because many of them have not been out of their home countries ever. And then we'll send them back. So they might come for a 6-month assignment, or they might come for a 2-year assignment. And this is a way for us to build our talent. This has worked for us in many parts of the developing world. So we started 7 years ago with the Novartis China University, and we have a Novartis Russia University, and it's a way for us really to build skill sets that we need to help us run our business. Now the second area is improving access to medicines. This was the strategy that will help us deliver inexpensive drugs to those patients in Africa that need it. We have a generics division called Sandoz. It's the #2 generics company in the world, and it works very closely with our efforts in Africa. We're establishing a registration process where we can take every new drug, not new drug because it's generics, but every drug that the Sandoz division has and bring them to Sub-Saharan Africa through a registration process. That's right now in the process of being worked. And you're talking about things like antibiotics, like antidiarrheals, like pain medication. But this is another way that if we increase access, we're going to be able to reach a lot more patients in Africa. The third strategy that I talked about is to build local capacity. If we don't manufacture our products, many of them will be generic products at first, in Africa, we're never going to get the kind of cost structure where we can really make an impact from a pricing standpoint in Africa. We're also working very hard to establish research and development activity there, more on the clinical development side, where we can work with hospitals in Sub-Saharan Africa and train physicians to work with our drugs. When we interact with physicians at that level, we're able to significantly increase their knowledge about innovative new drugs that are coming, but also generics that we're bringing onto the market that they might not have seen before. So this is all about creating that local capability for that will enable us to be an African company, in fact. And then the fourth is all around corporate responsibility. I showed you how there's a huge issue with communicable diseases right now, but also non-communicable diseases. And so corporate responsibility and doing what we do without profit is very important to help address some of the severe healthcare issues in Africa. And one example of that is the Novartis Malaria Initiative. This is one of the largest access to medicines programs in the world. We have a drug called Coartem that, as I said, in 3 days can cure malaria. But the issue is access. It's how do we get this malaria medicine into the rural parts of Sub-Saharan Africa so that we can ensure that children are not dying from a disease that is curable. And so every year we produce and sell at zero profit Coartem. About 100 million doses a year is what our maximum capacity is, and we reached 102 million doses. Not doses, actually treatments. So they're three-day treatments. And we have saved over a 10-year period a significant number of lives. This is a responsibility that we feel only Novartis is uniquely positioned to deliver because of the drug that we have called Coartem. And it's something that we've done over the many years. We also just entered into a collaboration with Malaria No More, because I think no single company or entity is going to be able to get malaria to where we need it to be. Malaria No More is a group that does public fundraising, and you can go online and you can donate treatments to children. So you donate, and for every, I think it's every dollar for a child, if you are for $10, that's a $10 treatment, or you could treat 10 children. And we are donating up to 3 million doses for free that would match those. And this is another commitment that we have. But really, I consider this is critically important, but it also is philanthropy. And we're now thinking that we have to move beyond philanthropy. There's a second set of programs that we have at Novartis as we think about Africa. And we call these programs social ventures. And it's more than just philanthropy. The thing about philanthropy is if I was hit by a bus, my successor might think that the malaria initiative is a good idea or might think it's not a good idea in terms of ways to spend the company's money. So the way to ensure sustainability is to create a money-making entity, not a big profit-generating entity, but something that will make money so that it will be sustainable and it will help the infrastructure in the country that it is designed to help. And so we have a program that actually started in India. And we brought it from India into parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, and we're starting right now in Kenya. And the way that it works is we take the rural villages in Kenya and we divide them up into cells. And in each cell there might be 50 villages. And in that one cell we'll hire a health educator, a Novartis health educator, and a Novartis sales supervisor. And those two people will visit each one of those villages, and the health educator will announce that she or he is providing a seminar on certain types of health care in the town village. And we get huge turnouts. This is not rocket science in terms of what they're teaching. They're teaching basic sanitation, but we're getting very, very large turnouts. And then at the same time, we're selling small pack sizes of some of our drugs through physicians in the area, and usually the sales supervisor will come with a physician that can prescribe that will enable us to increase access at low price points, small pack sizes, and it actually generates a very small profit. We then in turn hire more people in the area, rural villagers, that can help us move into the next cell. And this has proven in India to actually go from 3 years of profit loss, so we've been losing money for 3 years, to a break-even situation, and then we're plowing that profit back into the system, and that enables the sustainability that I think will make a significant impact on rural sub-Saharan Africa in terms of overall health care. So at Novartis, we are committed to developing, as I said earlier, new medicines that will change the practice of medicine. That's what this company is all about. But also we have a very, very deep commitment that to help improve health in developing nations. Sub-Saharan Africa is a big target for us right now. But we do this in a way that I think will be good for Novartis and Novartis shareholders. So we're able to build a good business over time, and at the same time, we're able to significantly impact the healthcare burden in those countries. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to open it up to questions. Yes?
Are you guys investing in that at all, and how do you see that changing?
We are. We're right now working with the Earth Institute, Jeffrey Sachs. Have you heard of Jeff Sachs? And he's got a program called the 1 Million Community Health Workers program, and we are working closely with him. We've donated money to help him bring community health care workers that could help substitute for the lack of primary care. He has some incredibly powerful research that shows that you don't always need a full-blown physician, that if you can get community health workers into some of those, particularly the rural areas, you can have a significant impact on healthcare. It's an issue, though. You know, as these governments start to have their economies grow, they're going to be faced with a lot of different priorities, right? You saw the way that the population is, the very young population, they're going to have to choose, am I spending on education, am I spending on health care? So I think this is going to be a long-term program, but it's definitely an issue. Yes?
The second one is hepatitis, I mean, preventable B and C. What kind of initiatives also do you have on hepatitis?
We have for type 2 diabetes, we have chosen to try to attack type 2 diabetes. We have a therapy that is growing around the world very rapidly. It's called a DPP-4 inhibitor, and it's an oral drug that you can take once a day to control blood sugar. Diabetes, though, is an exploding problem, and it's not just in the U.S. anymore. It's also even in emerging markets. China, I don't know if you know this, but China has 60 million diabetics. This is like the population of the UK. So it's no longer a disease of the developed world. In hepatitis, we have some very early programs that are in drug discovery. We have a drug right now that we sell in China called Sebivo for hepatitis B, but for hepatitis C, we're in the very early stages, and there are many other companies, though, that are really addressing hepatitis C.
Saying in the CPG industry to distribute your drugs, or are there ways that different industries can work together in order to solve the last mile challenge?
There are. You know, one of the things that we found in our malaria initiative is that when you're in a rural clinic, and let's say a woman has walked for 2 kilometers with her child to go to that rural clinic, 25% of the time they're out of stock. So can you imagine walking to a rural health clinic and your child is sick and then getting there and there's no quartum? So we worked with a number of companies to develop a program called SMS for Life. And what we were finding is that these rural health clinics, because there was not a lot of good coordination between product supply and the distributor, they didn't know when they were going to be out of stock. So we had every one of the rural health clinics just send an SMS at the end of the day and talk about their stocks. So how much stock did they have? And it all went into a central distributor that we had, and we were able to then have a much greater fulfillment, because everybody in Africa has a cell phone. It's like what we did is we said, look, we don't need a computer system to solve this logistics issue. We're going to solve it with the existing technology. And so a simple SMS allowed us to reduce the out-of-stock level from that 25% down to less than 5%. And that was through a collaboration with a number of different companies. Yes? Go ahead.
Talked a lot about your mission. You also mentioned about the business perspective. I wonder how these two lines, business lines and also mission lines, interact in your decision-making that you make.
Now, it's a very good question, right? How does a money-making company or an entity that has shareholders that demand a certain return also have a very, very deep mission that sometimes goes against that, not against, but is maybe inconsistent at some times? Well, we are uniquely Swiss, which means we have a very long-term view. I have the privilege of having a board of directors that tells me not to look at quarterly earnings. If you can imagine that, being an American, you're pretty much trained to look at quarterly earnings and to think about that. But we are building the business for the long term. Now, that mission is the core of what we do. So caring and curing is what we do, which means we're going to continue to spend $10 billion a year on research and development. And sometimes my shareholders yell at me and they say, look what, I won't use the name of the company, look what they're doing. They're cutting their R&D and they're laying off all their research and development people. And then I say, but look at their pipeline. Their drug pipelines are going to not be strong in the next 5 years. You can cut it 1 year, 2 years, but you can't continue to do that and have a good pipeline. So we are investing at the very high end of the industry. And it's a balance. You have to say, yes, we have shareholders that invest. I listen to our shareholders that are long-term holders. I do not listen to our shareholders who are day traders. Yes?
Can you explain the rationale behind focusing on insourcing while other pharma companies are trying to look at alternative avenues for accelerating drug discovery and development?
Yes, you have to draw a clear distinction between cutting research and development and outsource and what is right now called outsourcing to try to meet short earnings goals with actually looking for new technology. So even though we are, I wouldn't say insourcing, but we do a lot of our research in-house, we are looking constantly for new technologies that are emerging, and we will in-license those. So we generally, I try to keep our portfolio at 75% internally generated projects and 25% projects that come from the outside. Now, I think that's a very different strategy, and just the reason why we do that is that we've spent a lot of money building this capability, and I look at metrics, and right now Novartis has a track record of launching new medicines that's about twice as good as the average pharma company. So our success rate, if you go from phase 1 through launch, is actually twice as high as the average pharma company. So I say we're getting a pretty good return on that investment. So I'm going to continue to invest, but that doesn't mean not look at outside technologies. We still do that also.
How are you segmenting the Sub-Saharan Africa?
For non-generic? That's a good question. We are obviously offering all of our innovative drugs to anyone who needs them in Africa. We have a number of patient assistance programs, but there's not a huge market today for innovative medicines that are not reimbursed, because when you see the large percentage that is out of pocket, you see that there are not going to be patients that can afford it. So we have what we call patient assistance programs where we essentially give the drug. So for example, we're famous for this India case with our Gleevec drug, this chronic myeloid leukemia drug that I talked about that has a patent in every market in the world except India. And we drove, and I pushed very hard to take that. India would not grant a patent for Gleevec, and they said it was for patient access. They wanted it. They didn't want to grant a patent so that there could be generics, so there could be patient access. But that's just not right, because we give away 95% of all of the Gleevec in India. We give it away free through this patient assistance program, and that wouldn't have changed with a patent. The importance of a patent is that this is how we ensure that medical science continues to progress. Because we're engaged, and I ask my shareholders to engage in very high-risk activity, and that's discovery and development of new drugs. We have to get a return for that, and we can only get it through intellectual property. So we push that to a very, very hard level, and many people try to link that with access to medicines. But it really doesn't have much to do with access, because to your point about primary care and how it's the primary care infrastructure, it's the number of physicians, the number of nurses, the access to coartem that we can't even get to those nations. It's not because of intellectual property. But that's a little bit about the way that we think of it. Yes?
I'm curious what the issues are with the US FDA and the meningitis drug and why it wasn't approved. You for Princeton and Santa Barbara.
We're working with them very closely now that there's been an outbreak. For example, to give the U.S. FDA credit, they have moved very recently towards a much more progressive look at new drugs. So under Peggy Hamburg's leadership, the FDA is really proactive and taking a very proactive stance in terms of bringing new innovative medicines to Americans who need them. Yet at the same time, this was a meningitis B vaccine, and meningitis B is a deadly disease. It can kill in 24 hours. And yet there was a lot of discussion and debate about exactly the clinical trial program that would have to be done to be able to get that drug approved in the U.S. Now, we have extensively tested the vaccine, and we've tested it all over the world, and it's been approved in many countries in the world. But the U.S. still had certain issues that they wanted to see us test with this vaccine that weren't tested in previous, and I won't go into the details, but the vaccine has been proven safe and effective over many years. So now that there is an outbreak, I think we do have the opportunity to sit down with the FDA and say, can you look at the European data package that we have put together, and then have a discussion about it, whether there are ways to accelerate that into the U.S. Because I'm an American, and the fact that if I had a child or a grandchild that couldn't get vaccinated but could get vaccinated in Germany, I wouldn't like it. Yes?
I was wondering, because maybe the efforts are so fragmented, are you ever concerned about any redundancies in resolving these healthcare issues?
I think we have to work with partners. So if you're absolutely right in that everybody's looking at Africa and saying we're going to invest. So also, if you think about those healthcare issues, those aren't going to be solved by one company at all. So we're thinking about how do we work with the World Health Organization. So our malaria initiative is a good example of how we're working together. So it's a good point, and one of the issues is when you have competitors, sometimes the competitors don't like to work together. But if you have other types of companies, like you have a technology company that can deliver a certain type of benefit together with a pharma company and also a distribution company, you could really create some big solution.
There's other countries, particularly within emerging markets, where that's beginning to be a problem for pharma companies like Brazil, for example. So how are you guys thinking about working within markets such as Brazil and India, which are obviously huge markets?
They are huge markets, and right now I have said publicly that we won't do research in India. We will do, we have a very large center in Hyderabad where we do financial reporting and we do some analytics around marketing and we do a lot of back office support, but we won't do research because of the stance on intellectual property. It's very interesting because China gets it. China wants to build a science-based industry in China. And what you have seen is that government has made, in the last 5 years, great progress on protecting intellectual property. It's easier for us to get a patent now in China than it was 5 years ago, and it's easier for us to enforce patents if there's an attack on our patent in China. And in response to that, we're building a very large research and development site in Shanghai. It's costing us over $1 billion, but that's the difference, I think, between China and India in terms of the understanding of the fact that this is the way that life sciences can invest in coming up with breakthrough therapies. It just doesn't happen if there's not protection of intellectual property.
Are there products within the Novartis portfolio that you've opted not to pursue, even attempting to launch in the country, period, based off of other challenges in the supply chain, like cold chain storage and otherwise?
Yes. So there are some vaccines that we have in our vaccines division that unfortunately we can't launch into India because of, not India, into Sub-Saharan Africa because of the lack of cold chain distribution and ensuring that we're going to have quality assurance. So that's another example of how infrastructure itself, not access to medicines or vaccines, but its infrastructure keeps some of the products off the market. So as we start to develop and we build, we think that we can solve a large part of those.
And it's really commendable how the companies with the innovative drugs, how the company is trying to tackle. But I was wondering, like through these social responsibility initiatives, are you also looking at tackling the reason for such high occurrence? Like instead of, doing cure, like more like preventive, that why is it so high, 91% in Africa?
No, it's a very interesting thing. The Gates Foundation, I sit on the CEO roundtable with Bill Gates and a number of other pharma executives. And there's a guy at Gates by the name of Trevor Mundell, and he runs the public health side of the Gates Foundation. They're actually going to test complete eradication of malaria in a particular area by prophylactically giving everyone coartem, because the life cycle of a mosquito is so short that if you can treat everybody in a particular area over it's actually I think it's a 29-day cycle, you could potentially eradicate the disease in that area. So we are starting to think about how, in terms of why, we know why. It's because the disease is prevalent in terms of the temperature and the conditions. And there's people who are attempting spraying, and there's a lot of trying to go after the root cause of the problem. And there's also just some innovative thinking around how we could potentially eradicate the disease. So the question is, have you learned anything in other developing markets that will help in Sub-Saharan Africa? About 7 years ago, when I went into the pharma division, we had a growth rate in China that was only 5%. And yet the market in China was growing 20%. Because what was happening is the middle class in China was growing so fast, and the government was starting to reimburse at a level that was much better than what it had done in the past, that we were not getting a share of that. And we looked very hard at why. And the answer was that we did not have an integrated program. Yes, we might have hired more salespeople. And we said, oh, we can take our 5% up to 10 just by hiring more salespeople. And that was not right. We had to go in with physicians. We had to go in with research and development money. We had to do local manufacturing. So it's essentially the plan that you saw here is the plan that we initially did in China that has led to China becoming one of our biggest markets. So we're taking the lessons that we learned many years ago and applying it here.
So I was wondering, how do you see this collaborative efforts evolving, like when it comes to working with competition, and where do you draw the line?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer. Well, what I would say is, if you take this company's mission of caring and curing, there's collaboration that we must do with competitors, or else we're not going to be able to deliver our mission. So you're seeing companies like Novartis now start to collaborate with competitors. We're testing with Pfizer and with 2 other of our competitors a way to actually improve access to medicines in the Philippines that is a unique and varied approach that we've never taken before, and yet we're doing it with competitors. You have to be very careful, because from an antitrust standpoint, if it looks like you're working with a competitor to increase access to medicines, in many places that can get you into trouble. So you have to bring the lawyers along to every meeting and deciding what we can do and what we can't do in the market. But in terms of where to draw the line, I think it again comes back to that balance. We have people who invest their money in our company, and they expect us to be able to grow our sales and our earnings at a certain level, or we're not going to be able to attract their capital. Another company will get their capital. So it's my responsibility to be able to balance the corporate responsibility efforts and how much we spend on that with also the ensuring that we're getting a return for the money. We're not really thinking about Africa as a highly innovative market. We're starting with over-the-counter drugs, and we're starting with our generics because the patent regimes have not matured yet. Those economies are such that as they start to grow and they want to attract more business, and they understand that protecting intellectual property will be important, then you start to see the things that are put in place, like courts in those countries that can help us defend our patents, or also just the ability to get a patent in those countries. So we expect that to happen over time, but we're not waiting for that. We're going in with our generics business because we think that will be a big opportunity.
Some companies think about developing countries as an opportunity to test new technologies that may not be feasible in the US for regulatory reasons, because the infrastructure is here, because of interests. Like if you want to set up, for example, an artificial intelligence system that does diagnosis and prescription without a physician, you would want to do that in the US, it wouldn't be feasible. So I was wondering if you could explain a little about how you see digital health, what is going to be happening in digital health in the third world as well as in the US.
I would say that first of all, to answer your question, the first part of your question, we have one standard across the globe. So we will not do a trial in Africa that we would not do in the US. That's the first answer to that question. But digital health I see as a massive, massive element to changing healthcare in the developed world and in the developing world. All you have to do is look at what's crushing our healthcare system. Think about the fact that in the U.S. we spend 18% of GDP and we have worse outcomes in terms of infant mortality, life expectancy than Singapore, which only spends 3.5% of GDP. This is unbelievable. And if you think about what's driving that, part of it is just inefficiency in the system, right? The developed world spends over $4 trillion in healthcare, and we believe that 25% of that is wasted. Either a pill is given to somebody who's not going to respond to it, or people with heart failure come out of the hospital, they go back into the hospital, they come out of the hospital. So digital health, I think, will enable us. One easy example is remote patient monitoring. You can now give a remote patient, a monitor to a patient that will monitor heart rate, it will monitor blood pressure, it will monitor things that we were not able to measure before, and we'll be able to keep patients at home until they really need to come to the hospital, and we'll be able to reduce the waste of some of the waste that is occurring right now. So there's an explosion of technology in developing and developed worlds. In the developing world, the thing about technology is that you can leapfrog, right? You don't have some of the old infrastructure that you have in the West, in Western Europe, or in the U.S., like the fact that everybody's got a mobile phone. So mobile health in Africa is going to be probably faster than in the U.S. Yes?
Years. In an emerging country or area like Sub-Saharan Africa, how are you going to control counterfeit drugs and drugs that are being given after they're expired, for example?
Yeah, counterfeiting is a big issue because it's very easy to make a lot of money if somebody who has no, somebody who wants to counterfeit drugs in a country where there are not good checks and balances. As a company, we have a very large and strong security force that spends a lot of time investigating. They're kind of underground, so you don't hear a lot about them, but they are constantly investigating counterfeit drugs of Novartis in Africa, but even in the U.S. There are parts of the U.S. where there sometimes can be an issue. It's mostly outside the U.S., but I think the way to address it is to first recognize that it's an issue, and then secondly, put technologies in place that can prevent it. So the whole industry is about to invest in this technology called track and trace, that from the very beginning of the production of one drug, you will be able to identify through a basic scan where that drug was produced, whether it was the original drug or not, and what the expiration date is. And you'll be able to do this in a way that we've never been able to do before, but we had to get to standards across the whole industry. So it's recognizing the problem and then investing in technology to fix it. Yes?
You mentioned about how you're so focused on innovation, R&D, and bringing that onshore, but I was also interested in just how you see computational methods and high throughput drug screening and how just the evolution of drug discovery has been changing and what Novartis is doing about that.
Drug discovery is on the verge of an incredible, I think, renaissance. When you think about big data and you think about the fact that deep sequencing of the human genome is so easy and it's so cheap, we have a very large oncology business, and we are now deep sequencing with the patient's consent, every tumor type, every oncology patient that we have. It's creating an explosion of data. Now, we're also, though, building a bioinformatics capability in our research organization that can help us make sense of this data. But think about the ability to link genetic mutations, multiple genetic mutations, not just one or two, but multiple genetic mutations in terms of understanding disease and disease targets. So I personally believe that it's going to change the way that drugs are discovered, and you're going to see in the next 10 years breakthroughs that we haven't seen in a long time.
You also mentioned earlier on that you guys have a big generics business and that's what you're going to push for in Sub-Saharan Africa. At what point is Novartis says that, okay, we've had this drug patented for about 10, 15 years we've been reaping the profits, and now maybe we'll pass it on to our generics version and pushing
Yes.
that out. Is that changing currently? And given the international community's move towards using more compulsory licenses and non-voluntary licenses, would Novartis be more willing to either produce their own generics or pursuing like negotiations in order to receive royalties?
Yes, many people ask us how we can have an innovative pharma division and at the same time have a generics division, because they say, aren't those two things incredibly inconsistent? And I say they're absolutely consistent. We are fundamentally pro-patent because that's how medical science advances. You have to have patents for us to invest in breakthrough new cancer drugs, for example. But we also believe that the day that that patent expires, so we're not asking for any more than the patent period. The day that it expires, it's our obligation to offer low-cost, high-quality generic versions. And so we give it immediately to our generics division. So for the example in India, that was a patent that we never received ever. So we wouldn't be asking to extend a patent. We don't want to extend a patent. All we want is that period that we think we need so that we can continue to invest. Other questions? Yes. I think we have a time for maybe one or two. Yes?
What worries you most about leading the company into the future?
What worries me the most? I would say thinking about health systems around the world, right? If you look at what's happening, the aging population is going to lead to demand for health care in the next 20 years that is going to be significantly more than it is today. And yet there are governments around the world that cannot pay for health care. And I don't mean pharmaceuticals, I mean hospitals, physicians, nurses. So one of the things that worries me is how is Novartis going to be part of the solution around health systems, not just transaction of selling the pill, but delivering a positive outcome for health systems so that we can lower the total cost of expense. Pharmaceuticals are only 10% of the cost of health care. Many people think it's 50%, but it's really the infrastructure cost that we have to address lower costs for health care, or else we're all going to be in trouble because these governments are just not going to be able to take care of the people as they age. So that's really the biggest thing that I worry about. Listen, it was great to be here. I want to thank everybody for coming, and good luck as you continue your studies.